The night was dark and stormy, the kind where the sea roared like a beast and the wind howled through the trees. Inside the cold, damp walls of a castle, a young prince named Edward sat alone, his heart heavy with dread. He knew he was trapped, a pawn in a game of power and revenge between his parents. His father, King Edward II, had sent a final, angry letter, threatening to make Edward an example if he continued to disobey. The words were etched in Edward's mind. If you now act contrary to our counsel and continue in willful disobedience, you will feel it all the days of your life, and you will be made an example to all other sons who are disobedient to their lords and fathers. Edward's hands trembled as he read the letter again. He couldn't go back to England, not now. His mother, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, had their own plans. They were gathering forces in Hainault, a distant land where Edward's future bride, Philippa, awaited him. The thought of Philippa brought a glimmer of hope, but it was a fragile light in the darkness of his situation. In the halls of the castle, whispers of rebellion echoed. Isabella and Mortimer were marshalling their forces, planning an invasion of England. Edward's father had become a tyrant, and the kingdom was on the brink of chaos. The king had even tried to bribe Frenchmen to kidnap Isabella and Mortimer, but the queen was one step ahead. She had fled in secret, warned by her cousin Robert d'Artois of the danger that lurked around every corner. As the storm raged outside, Edward's thoughts turned to the future. He was to marry Philippa, the youngest daughter of Count William of Hainault, in 2 years. The marriage was the linchpin of their plan, a promise that would secure the support of the Hainaulter mercenaries. Edward had met Philippa during a stay in Valenciennes, and he had been drawn to her immediately. She was graceful, intelligent, and kind, and he had felt a connection that he had never felt before. On the night of September 22nd, 1326, the storm reached its peak. The fleet set sail from Brill, carrying Isabella, Mortimer, and Edward to the shores of England. The journey was treacherous, with high winds and rough seas, but they pressed on, driven by a fierce determination. After 2 days, they landed at Walton on the coast of Suffolk, in the lands of the Earl of Norfolk, Edward's uncle. News of their arrival spread like wildfire. Men from all over the kingdom flocked to their side, drawn by the promise of a better future. Isabella, dressed in widow's weeds, played the part of a wronged queen, come to avenge the wrongs of Hugh Despenser, the king's hated favorite. Mortimer, ever cautious, kept a low profile, knowing that his presence might cast doubt on their cause. Edward, on the other hand, was hailed as the future king, the Earl of Chester and Duke of Aquitaine. The royal household in London was in turmoil. King Edward II, realizing the gravity of the situation, fled westward with Despenser, hoping to escape the wrath of the invaders, but the king's plans were doomed. On October 6th, they reached the royal fortress of Wallingford, only to find that the invaders were already closing in. 3 days later, as the king marched into Gloucester, the invaders were at Dunstable. On October 10th, the king received a devastating blow. Henry of Lancaster, the most powerful man in the realm, had declared for the invaders. The king's last hope was gone. Despenser and the king tried to escape by boat from Chepstow, but the wind turned against them, forcing them back to shore. The king's fate was sealed. In London, the city was in chaos. The mob had broken into the Tower, dragging out Edward's 9-year-old brother, John, and setting him up as a mock ruler. Bishop Stapleton, trying to stop the rioters, was dragged from his horse and beheaded, his head sent to Isabella as a grim trophy. Edward and his mother were welcomed with open arms in town after town, but the joy was bittersweet. The country had turned against his father, and the authority of the crown was crumbling. On October 15th, the invaders issued a proclamation in Edward's name, declaring that the king had been led astray by evil men. The same day, Bishop Orleton preached a sermon, calling the king a tyrant and a sodomite. Edward knew that his father's reputation was being destroyed, and a new tyranny was rising in its place. On October 26th, Bristol Castle fell to Mortimer, and the Earl of Winchester, Hugh Despenser's father, was beheaded. The king had fled the country, and the invaders declared Edward regent, giving him the title and the responsibility. But Edward knew he was a pawn, not a king. His mother and Mortimer held the real power, and the man they chose to be treasurer, Bishop Orleton, was the same one who had preached against the king. Edward was as much on the defensive as his father, and the future was uncertain. On December 16th, King Edward II and his companions were captured near Antwerp. The king was taken to Kenilworth Castle, while Despenser and his henchmen were brought to Hereford to face justice. On November 24th, Despenser was dragged through the streets, hanged and tortured in a brutal public spectacle. The message was clear: the old regime was dead, and a new one was rising from its ashes. The royal party spent Christmas at Wallingford Castle, celebrating their victory. But Edward knew that the storm of betrayal was far from over. The road ahead was filled with shadows, and the future was as uncertain as the night that had brought them to England. Just 2 days after being crowned, Edward found himself sitting on his throne, presiding over his first parliament. The room was filled with the most powerful lords and bishops in the land, but it quickly became clear that two figures would dominate the proceedings: the Earl of Lancaster and Roger Mortimer. Lancaster was a force to be reckoned with. He was a royal earl, a grandson of Henry III, and the wealthiest lord in the country. He had a lot to say and wasn't afraid to say it. As Edward watched from his throne, Lancaster started laying out his demands. He wanted a pardon for himself and the other invaders who had helped Isabella and Mortimer take control. He also wanted his dead brother, Thomas, to be pardoned for his past opposition to Edward II, which would allow Lancaster to inherit his brother's lands and titles. Edward listened carefully and agreed to most of Lancaster's demands, but he couldn't give Lancaster everything. Isabella had already taken some of the lands for herself, and Edward couldn't just hand them over. Lancaster didn't stop there. He proposed that since Edward was still just a boy, a council of regency should be formed to help govern the kingdom. This council would be made up of 12 or 14 trusted men, and Lancaster wanted to lead it. He also brought up a lot of old grievances, many dating back to the days when his brother Thomas had opposed Edward II. He talked about curbing the abuses of jailers, putting restrictions on the appointment of justices of the peace, and preventing the king from making private contracts with lords to supply troops. He even demanded limits on how much the king could tax the people. Lancaster was using this parliament to push through a whole list of reforms that would give him and the other nobles more power. Throughout all of this, Mortimer remained quiet. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, especially not with Lancaster on such a role. But Mortimer was a shrewd politician, and he knew that he needed to keep a close eye on Lancaster. Lancaster's plans could undermine Mortimer's own power, and that was something Mortimer couldn't allow. Edward, sitting on his throne, felt the tension in the room. He was only 14, and he was still learning how to navigate the complex world of politics. He knew that he couldn't just agree to everything Lancaster wanted, but he also couldn't afford to anger the powerful Earl. It was a delicate balancing act, and Edward was learning that being king wasn't just about making grand speeches and wearing a crown. It was about making tough decisions and dealing with powerful lords who each had their own agendas. As the Parliament continued, Edward realized that he was going to have to be careful. He couldn't let Lancaster or Mortimer control him, but he also needed their support to rule effectively. The next few years would be a test of his strength and cunning, and Edward knew that he would have to be smart if he wanted to keep his throne and his power. For now, he could only sit and listen, but he was already starting to form his own plans. The political games in the Parliament were subtle and complex. Thomas of Lancaster, a powerful earl, was trying to set the political agenda and use Parliament to increase his influence over the weak monarchy. King Edward III, who was only a teenager, had to follow advice and play the role of a monarch, doing what the Council of Regency told him to do. Roger Mortimer, on the other hand, had a different strategy. He didn't want to challenge Lancaster in Parliament. Instead, he used his influence through Queen Isabella. Mortimer let Lancaster think he was in charge, but behind the scenes, Mortimer and Isabella were the real power players. They made sure to keep the ex-king, Edward II, under their control. When some lords tried to free Edward II, Mortimer saw the danger. If Edward II was freed, he could revoke laws and take control, which would be a big problem for Mortimer and Isabella. So they moved Edward II from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle, where he was guarded by Mortimer's trusted men. For young Edward III, these moves were very worrying. He couldn't trust either Lancaster or Mortimer. Lancaster was pushing his own agenda, making Edward confirm laws like Magna Carta. Mortimer was doing things his own way, using people and not following official rules. Isabella was also a powerful figure, but her main goal was to get more money. Edward felt powerless and knew he needed to prove himself as a king. To do this, Edward focused on becoming a great warrior. He ordered lots of new armor and weapons, and he participated in tournaments to show his strength and bravery. He wanted to be seen as a leader, not just a puppet on the throne. His actions were a way to show that he was determined to be a strong king. Meanwhile, the Scots were also aware of the young king's situation. They attacked Norham Castle on the day of Edward's coronation, but the attack failed. The Scots were unhappy because Mortimer and Isabella had promised to recognize Scotland as an independent kingdom, but they didn't keep their promise. Robert Bruce, the Scottish king, was getting old and sick, and he wanted to achieve his goal of an independent Scotland. He decided to launch attacks to pressure the English into giving in. Mortimer and Isabella didn't want a war, but Lancaster had reasons to want the army ready. The northern lords were upset because the Scots were demanding their rights to land in Scotland, even though they had lost control of it. Lancaster and the other northern lords refused to give up these rights, so there was no peace. The English army was ordered to prepare for an attack. In July, Edward set out with the army, determined to show his leadership. The English army was slow and disorganized, while the Scots were quick and clever. The Scots, led by Sir Thomas Randolph and Black Douglas, outmaneuvered the English. Edward tried to take control by offering a knighthood and a yearly income to anyone who could find the Scots. An esquire named Thomas Rokeby found the Scots but was captured. When he returned and told Edward what happened, Edward honored his honesty by making him a knight. The English army finally caught up with the Scots, who were positioned on a hill. Edward was eager to fight, but Mortimer called off the attack, saying it was too risky. Edward was furious, but had to accept that Mortimer was in charge. The English camped near the Scots, and the Scots kept them awake all night with loud noises. The next day, the Scots moved to an even better position, and the siege continued. One night, Black Douglas and his men quietly crossed the river and attacked the English camp. They cut the ropes of the tents and killed many English soldiers. Edward himself was almost captured, but was saved by one of his chaplains. The attack was a shock to Edward, and he saw the horrors of war for the first time. Despite the bravery of his men, the Scots managed to escape, leaving the English in a frustrating stalemate. For Edward, this was a harsh lesson in the realities of war and the challenges of leadership. He realized that he had a long way to go to prove himself as a strong king. The events following Edward's father's supposed death threw the young king into a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainties. Edward had always had a strained relationship with his father, but the news of his death still hit him hard. The man had been a king, and with that title came a heavy burden that Edward, even as the new monarch, understood all too well. The grief and the sense of loss were compounded by the fear and suspicion that Mortimer, the powerful and dictatorial figure who controlled the court, might have been behind the old king's death. Edward's fear was not unfounded. Mortimer had already shown his ability to manipulate the country, the parliament, and even the king himself. When the news of Edward II's death reached the court, it was Mortimer who orchestrated the elaborate funeral preparations. A grand hearse was built, and a wooden effigy of the late king was crafted, complete with a gilded copper crown. The funeral was a magnificent display, with hundreds of candles, incense burners, and images of the evangelists adorning the hearse. Edward, his mother, and the rest of the royal family attended the funeral, which took place on December 20th, 1327. The body was laid to rest in Gloucester Abbey, and the world believed that Edward II was no more. However, the young king's world was about to be turned upside down. Shortly after the funeral, while traveling to Worcester, Edward received shocking news. His father was not dead. The letters that had announced the king's death were a fabrication. Edward had been tricked, and the elaborate funeral had been for a false body. This revelation left Edward feeling betrayed and trapped. He had not only announced his own father's death, but had also participated in the funeral, all while his father was still alive, albeit in hiding. The implications were terrifying. If Mortimer could deceive him so easily, what else might he do? Could Mortimer turn against him next? In the midst of this turmoil, Edward's life took a bright turn. On January 24th, 1328, he met his bride, Philippa of Hainault, at the gates of York. Philippa was a welcome presence, a kind and pretty young woman who shared Edward's interests and provided him with the loyalty and support he desperately needed. They were married the next day in the cathedral, with a grand celebration attended by thousands. The Hainaulters, Philippa's family, were equally enthusiastic, and the atmosphere was one of joy and hope. Philippa quickly became Edward's confidante and a source of strength. She brought with her a group of loyal pages and servants, including Walter Manny, who would become a lifelong friend. This inner circle was crucial for Edward, as he needed people he could trust in a court where Mortimer's influence was pervasive. The joy of his marriage was short-lived, however, as Edward faced new challenges. In February 1328, King Charles of France, Isabella's brother, died without an heir. This opened up the possibility of Edward making a claim to the French throne through his mother. While this might have seemed a promising development, it only added to Edward's problems. Mortimer and Isabella were preparing to give up sovereignty over Scotland, a decision that would alienate the northern barons and dishonor Edward's grandfather, who had fought hard for control of Scotland. Edward was determined to make his disagreement with these terms known. He began to quietly plan his strategy, but his plans received an unexpected boost in March. Mortimer, Isabella, and other key figures left the court, leaving Edward in the care of a few trusted advisors. This gave him a brief window of opportunity to act on his own. During this time, Edward's uncle, the Earl of Kent, also disappeared from court. Kent had been close to Mortimer, but their relationship had soured. Kent had discovered that Edward II was still alive, a piece of information that added another layer of complexity to Edward's already fraught situation. The knowledge that his father was alive, and the possibility of a rescue attempt, made Edward even more wary of Mortimer. He knew that if his father were to be freed, he would be completely at the mercy of Mortimer, who had already demonstrated his power and ruthlessness. Edward's fear and suspicion only grew, and he knew he had to be careful and strategic in his actions. As the spring of 1328 unfolded, Edward found himself caught between the weight of his responsibilities, the threats to his power, and the loyalty of his new wife. He was a young king, but he was determined to assert his authority and protect his kingdom, even as he navigated the treacherous waters of court politics. Edward was only 15 and a half when he faced one of the most challenging moments of his young life. The year was 1328, and the situation in England was tense. Parliament had gathered at Northampton to discuss war with France and the threat from Scotland. But the biggest danger was closer to home: his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, who held the real power. Mortimer and Isabella were making decisions without Edward's input, and his uncle, the Earl of Kent, was a potential threat. Edward felt trapped, forced to navigate between the competing interests of his mother, Mortimer, and his uncle. He had to watch as Mortimer used his name and authority to control the country, even though it wasn't what Edward wanted. Despite the pressure, Edward tried to stand up for himself. When Mortimer and Isabella decided to make Scotland independent, Edward's uncle, the Earl of Lancaster, spoke out against it. But Mortimer, with his strong influence, forced Edward to ratify the treaty. This was a blow to Edward's pride and his sense of responsibility as king. The humiliation continued as Edward and his stepmother, Philippa, were dragged to Hereford to attend a wedding and tournament hosted by Mortimer. Being at Mortimer's beck and call was a constant reminder of his powerlessness. From Hereford they traveled to Mortimer's castle at Ludlow, then to Worcester, where discussions about the war with France took place. Edward was present, but he had no say in the decisions being made. Despite the challenges, Edward was not completely passive. He had a moment of defiance when he refused to attend his sister Joan's wedding to the son of Robert Bruce. He stayed in England while his mother and Mortimer went north. This small act of resistance showed that he was not entirely under their control. In August 1328, Edward's brother John turned 12. John became an ally for Edward, and together they tried to push back against Mortimer's growing influence. When Mortimer demanded the title of Earl of March, Edward countered by making John the Earl of Cornwall. This show of support for his brother was a clear message to Mortimer that Edward was not going to be pushed around. The tensions between Mortimer, Lancaster, and Edward reached a boiling point in September. Lancaster threatened to use force against Mortimer and the king, and Edward had to act quickly to avoid capture. He fled to Gloucester, where Mortimer and Isabella were waiting. This move saved him from falling into Lancaster's hands, but it also highlighted the danger he was in. Despite the victory, Edward's situation didn't improve. Mortimer's power grew, and he was named Earl of March. Edward had to perform the ceremony, but he also made his brother and a close friend, James Butler, earls. These acts were small victories in a sea of challenges. The year 1328 was a tough one for Edward. He was caught between Mortimer and Lancaster, like a gazelle between two lions. When Mortimer defeated Lancaster, it didn't make Edward's life easier. His uncles, the Earls of Norfolk and Kent, had their own issues with Mortimer. Kent, in particular, wanted to see Mortimer removed from power and began planning a mission to rescue Edward's father, who was believed to be dead but might still be alive. In May 1329, Edward set out for France to do homage for his French possessions. He was accompanied by a group of trusted friends, including William Montagu and Robert Ufford, who had known him since he was a child. These friends were also threatened by Mortimer's influence and were ready to help Edward. The journey to France was smooth, but the ceremony of homage was not. Edward swore allegiance to King Philip, but something about it didn't feel right. He left France in a hurry, returning to England within 6 days. The reason for his sudden departure is unclear, but it might have been related to news about his father or the growing threat from his uncle Kent. Back in England, Edward faced more problems. Mortimer's confidence grew, and he even played the part of King Arthur at a tournament, a clear message that he saw himself as the real ruler. Edward, now almost 17, realized he needed to take action. He sent William Montagu to the Pope in Avignon to explain his situation and seek support. Montagu's mission was secret, but Mortimer found out and sent his own man to monitor the trip. Despite this, Montagu managed to see the Pope and explain Edward's plight. The Pope promised to help and asked Edward to send a secret letter with a special sign. Edward's journey to reclaim his power had begun. He was young, but he was determined to take control of his kingdom and free himself from the influence of Mortimer and Isabella. The road ahead was long and challenging, but Edward was ready to face it.